When Americans think about the origins of their oldest fortunes, they imagine steel barons and railroad kings, oil tycoons and banking dynasties. They picture men who built industries, connected continents, or struck black gold in Texas fields. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, men who built America. But there's a darker story buried beneath the marble facades of Boston's Beacon Hill and the manicured lawns of Newport mansions. Some of America's most respected family names, names that still echo in the halls of power today, built their empires not on innovation or honest trade, but on something far more sinister. They got rich selling drugs to China. And the profits from that trade didn't just disappear into history. They became the foundation stones of American high society. This isn't ancient history. This is the story of how opium money built universities, funded museums, and established bloodlines that still shape American power. The men who orchestrated this trade weren't outlaws or criminals in the eyes of their peers. They were pillars of their communities, church-going merchants who saw nothing wrong with flooding an entire civilization with addiction. And when the Chinese governments finally said no, these same men helped drag America into wars to keep the drugs flowing. This was the first great American drug cartel, operating with government protection and social respectability. And if you think the war on drugs is complicated today, wait until you see how it all began. Let's start with a name that every American knows, a name synonymous with wealth itself: Forbes. But before Malcolm Forbes was collecting motorcycles and throwing lavish parties, his ancestor, Robert Bennett Forbes, was collecting something else entirely: chests of opium bound for Chinese ports. Forbes wasn't just dabbling in the drug trade. He was one of its architects, a man who turned addiction into an art form and human misery into generational wealth. Robert Bennett Forbes entered the China trade in the 1830s. The business model was brutally simple. British merchants grew opium poppies in Bengal, India. American ships, known for their speed, would transport the drug to China, and Chinese addicts would pay in silver, which flowed back west. Everyone profited, except for the millions of Chinese people who watched their society crumble. Forbes saw this system and didn't flinch. He saw opportunity. What made the American opium merchants different from their British counterparts wasn't morality, it was efficiency. The British had to navigate the politics of empire and the bureaucracy of the East India Company. Americans, they were freelancers in the drug trade. They could move faster, take bigger risks, and pocket larger shares of the profits. Forbes epitomized this. He built a fleet of the fastest ships on the ocean, sleek clippers like the Antelope, designed specifically to outrun Chinese naval patrols and British competitors. He captained the ships himself, personally overseeing cargo loads worth millions in today's money. Each voyage was a calculated gamble. Chinese authorities had begun cracking down, seizing ships and executing dealers. Pirates prowled the shipping lanes. But Forbes had nerves of steel. By the late 1830s, he was one of the premier American China merchants, a polite term for a drug kingpin. And Forbes was not alone. There was Warden Delano Jr., grandfather of future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He spent years in Canton, managing the drug trade for Russell and Company, the largest American opium dealer in Asia. There was John Jacob Astor, America's first multimillionaire. While he may have direct involvement, his ships regularly carried opium as cargo, and his trading network provided the infrastructure that made the entire enterprise possible.
The Astors, the Delanos, the Forbeses, the Perkinses to Cushings, these weren't isolated cases. This was the foundation of Boston and New York's merchant aristocracy. But a question lingered. How did these men, these pillars of the community, justify a trade that was actively destroying a nation? And more importantly, how did they turn this dirty drug money into clean, respectable American wealth?
To understand how they laundered the money, you first have to understand the scale of the destruction. By the 1830s, China had an estimated 4 million opium addicts. By the 1850s, that number would climb to 12 million. Entire regions of the country were economically devastated as workers abandoned their jobs to feed their habits. The Chinese government watched helplessly as silver, the lifeblood of their economy, drained out of the country to pay for a product that was killing its citizens. This wasn't just trade, it was economic warfare, conducted by private merchants who had turned human weakness into a global business model. American merchants became experts at exploitation. They developed new, more potent varieties of opium. They established credit systems, allowing addicts to go into debt for their next fix, creating cycles of dependency impossible to break. And back home, in Boston, in New York, these same men were celebrated as paragons of civic virtue. They attended church every Sunday. They donated lavishly to charities. They funded hospitals like the Massachusetts General Hospital using the very money they earned from creating millions of patients overseas. The moral compartmentalization was breathtaking. John Perkins Cushing, another opium baron, returned to Boston and built one of the city's grandest estates. Warren Delano wrote letters home complaining about the moral degradation of the Chinese, all while his ships were unloading the poison that caused it. They saw themselves as righteous. They saw the Chinese as heathens, and their suffering as a distant, abstract cost of doing business. But that business was about to face its greatest threat. In 1839, the Chinese government finally said no. The emperor sent an incorruptible official, Commissioner Lin Zexu, to Canton, with one mission: end the opium trade once and for all. Lin wasn't negotiating. He surrounded the foreign factories where the American and British merchants lived. He cut off their supplies and blockaded their ships. He demanded they surrender every last chest of opium. For men like Robert Forbes and Warren Delano, this was the nightmare scenario. The Chinese weren't just demanding bribes, they were dismantling the entire system. After a tense 6-week standoff, the merchants capitulated. Over 20,000 chests of opium, millions of pounds of narcotics, were handed over. Commissioner Lin had it all publicly destroyed, mixed with lime and salt, and dumped into the sea. The drug dealers back home were outraged. They didn't see themselves as criminals whose racket had been shut down. They saw themselves as legitimate businessmen robbed by a tyrannical government. They screamed about free trade and property rights. The British government listened. Eager to protect their massive profits, they declared war. The First Opium War began. The British Navy, with its ironclad warships, decimated the Chinese fleet. They blockaded ports, seized cities, and brought the Qing dynasty to its knees. And the Americans? The American government officially stayed neutral, but its merchants played a far more cynical game. While the British were fighting, American merchants, like Forbes, simply moved their smuggling operations to more remote ports, bribing local officials and filling the market void the British had left. They even sold ships to the British to aid their war effort. When the war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, China was broken. They were forced to pay massive indemnities, cede Hong Kong to Britain, and, most importantly, open 5 new treaty ports to foreign trade. The treaty didn't explicitly legalize opium. It just made it infinitely easier to smuggle. For the American drug dealers, this was a jackpot. The British had fought the war, and the Americans rushed in to reap the benefits. The profits that flowed back to America after the war dwarfed anything that had come before. The trade was now bigger, more sophisticated, and more profitable than ever. But the money was still dirty. It was still profits from addiction and misery. So what do you do with millions of dollars in drug money in 1840s America? You don't hide it. You cleanse it. You build America with it. This is the final, most audacious step of the operation, the Great American Laundry. The opium profits flowed back to America like a golden river, and they were immediately channeled into the most respectable institutions in the country. Let's start with the Ivy League. Harvard University, America's oldest and most prestigious institution, was built, in part, on opium money. The Perkins family, whose fortune came directly from dealing drugs in China, donated massive sums to establish professorships and fund buildings. John Perkins Cushing funded the university's first astronomical observatory. When you walk through Harvard Yard today, you are walking on ground purchased with the profits of Chinese misery. The same pattern repeated at Yale. The Russell family, whose Russell and Company was the largest American opium dealer in Asia, became major benefactors. Yale's most exclusive secret society, Skull and Bones, was co-founded by William Huntington Russell, whose family fortune was inseparable from the drug trade. The connection wasn't hidden. It was simply ignored. But the money didn't stop at education. It financed America's manifest destiny. The Transcontinental Railroad, the artery that connected America from coast to coast, was funded, partly, with opium profits. The Central Pacific Railroad, which built the western section of the line, was financed by investors who had made their fortunes selling drugs to China. And the perverse, bitter irony, that railroad was built by the hands of Chinese immigrant labor. Think about that. Men who had fled their homeland, a homeland devastated by the very addiction crisis these merchants had fueled, now found themselves building American infrastructure for the exact same men who had profited from their country's destruction. Chinese hands built American railroads with money that came from Chinese addiction. It is a symbolism so perfect it's sickling. The money also transformed American finance. The financial networks that had moved drug money became the backbone of American banking. Institutions that financed opium shipments now provided the capital for America's industrial expansion: steel mills, textile factories, and mining operations. John Jacob Astor had shown the way, converting his profits into vast swaths of Manhattan real estate. Families like the Delanos and Forbeses perfected the technique. They bought entire neighborhoods, transforming drug money into American soil, into the very bedrock of New York and Boston. The money didn't disappear. It multiplied, carrying its dark origins into every corner of the American economy. By the 1870s, the transformation was complete. These families hadn't just laundered their money, they laundered their history. They funded historians, endowed libraries, and commissioned biographies that celebrated their entrepreneurship, their vision, and their Yankee ingenuity. The opium years were glossed over, reduced to a footnote, or erased entirely. They created foundations and charitable institutions that celebrated their philanthropy, forever cleansing the source of their wealth. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental. It was a strategy. It was carefully cultivated by families who understood that their power and respectability depended on forgetting their origins. The result is an American elite whose power rests on forgotten crimes, institutions whose prestige comes from laundered money, and a national mythology that celebrates entrepreneurs who, in fact, were drug dealers. The opium fortunes didn't just fade away, they became the bedrock of American high society. Today, when politicians lecture other nations about drug trafficking, when universities celebrate their founders, they are standing on foundations built by foundations, built by the first great American drug cartel. The real drug dealers weren't hiding in back alleys. They were sitting in boardrooms, building libraries, and creating the America we inherited. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand where your institutions really came from, you'll never understand how power actually works. If this opened your eyes to the stories they don't want you to know, subscribe. History has the answers if you're willing to look for them.